Dear colleagues, it is a great pleasure and honor to talk to you today about the sexual life of LGBTQ people. However, since this is a very wide field, I will focus mainly on homosexuality, because homosexuality is also, from a sexual health point, seen the main issue about the sexual life of LGBTQ. Because, well, mainly there are only two ways to express your sexuality, either as man or as woman. Also, when you identify yourself as man, like a woman, you will still have the same sexual life as a woman. Not necessarily the psychological life, but definitely the sexual life. So please bear with me and listen to me when I'm talking mainly about homosexuality, because of course it always includes also the sexual life of LGBTQ people who live a so-called queer lifestyle. Let me first try to identify the term homosexuality, how it is defined today, so to understand what professionals in the field of sexology today think homosexuality constitutes. We will start with the one definition that is the most important for sexual health policies. Because usually we think that homosexuality has something to do with how an individual feels about himself or herself. From a sexual health perspective, the main interest lies on what the people are doing actually, because the doing is what makes sexual behavior in some way health relevant. So today we use usually, especially for the male homosexuality, the term MSM, which means men who have sex with other men. Although it looks like it only includes men, of course, female homosexuality is also included. This term, MSM, has established itself worldwide in the field of public health and sexual health. It describes a specific behavior. And the advantage of describing a specific behavior is that it is statistically clear. When you ask people, are you homosexual? Then you will get into a can of worms, because most people not necessarily identify themselves as homosexuals, but they act in a homosexual way. So this term is very loaded, and it is much more useful to use a neutral way to approach homosexuality. So all homosexual behavior is included in that. Whether you are a man who identifies himself as man, or whether you are a man who identifies himself as woman, or if you don't identify yourself as a homosexual, but actually prefer to have sex with other men, you are always included. So it is free, especially this term is free from all, especially Western cultural implications, but that's also true for other cultural implications. It does not impose any sexual orientation or identity. It is understood in all cultures, and it allows broad attribution of resulting consequences, which means in the field of sexual health, the spread of diseases and social sanctions. So I think the term MSM is very apt to describe what is actually going on. And because it is so clear, we can use it in every context, especially also the therapeutic context. As you know, a big problem of dealing with homosexuality is that quite a large part of the homosexual community is in the closet, which means that they don't accept their homosexuality as a fact. They can, of course, accept that the fact that they have actual sex with other men, but they can't accept the fact that it has also something to do with their emotions or with their identity, not even with what is called homosexual orientation. When we deal with our clients, we have always to be careful not to hurt their feelings. We always have to accept that every single individual has a different approach towards its own life and its own sexuality. So whenever we assume something with a term we use like homosexuality, it makes it very difficult for the individual not to either embrace too much this term, which is actually a kind of influence we have as therapists, or to deny that they are even behaving in a certain way. Why don't we use the term homosexual orientation? Because sexual orientation, not only homosexual orientation, is defined as a sustained interest in a specific gender. And as we all see in our practices when we deal with men who have sex with other men, they don't necessarily see themselves as exclusively orientated towards men only. So, what is the definition of a sustained interest in another gender? Well, in heterosexual people, of course, it is also a reproductive interest. Now, you might add, well, yes, of course, also homosexual couples can have a reproductive interest, but this is a secondary aspect, not the primary aspect, because a man can't get another man pregnant. Today, due to the amazing advances in medical research, it is possible that the man changes his body in a way that it looks much more female and is even able to bear another child. But this is still not the same as the reproductive interest between a man and a woman, because the act of sex is uncoupled from this definition. A second aspect which is important to understand the term sexual orientation is, of course, the emotion. Contrary to the term men who have sex with men, it is not just the factual act of sex that plays the main role, but it is also the emotion that plays a big role. Meaning, do you feel comfortable to have sex with another person based on its gender? As we all know, this is one of the main things that makes sex so interesting, that we don't only connect our genitals, but we also connect how we feel. Very close to this emotion is, of course, the term romantic love. Meaning, can you fall in love with a specific person in regard to her or his gender? This is very crucial to understand. While sex is actually possible in many ways, as you all know, the main outlet for sexual urges is masturbation. But of course, there are very few people who actually fantasize about themselves when they are masturbating. They are usually fantasizing about another person or another persons. The crucial thing to understand is that sexuality has at least three, let's say, main aspects. There is the bodily, the physical aspect, but there is also a sensual aspect, and then there is also an identity aspect, which plays a huge role in the imagination of the person. What we have to understand is that all the different parts of sexuality are not necessarily always available to us. Sometimes only a physical interaction is possible. So we try to help our body to release its sexual energy in a way that is pleasant. That's okay. But most people think this is not enough. If it would be enough, okay, we could say, then it would really play absolutely no role in which way we achieve sexual pleasure. And indeed, as you all know, there are many people who actually have sex either with things or with animals or with whomever person they are able to approach with. But for many, it is not enough to just have another body or another thing to have sex with. It is also important that your very soul is also connected with the other person, which is a little bit difficult when you have sex, let's say, with a vacuum cleaner or a goat. So, what we have to understand is that sexuality needs all three parts to become an important part to us. Finally, there is also the important thing of affection. Do we feel near the other person? As you now probably already see, the term man who have sex with man is so attractive because all the other aspects makes it very difficult to really pinpoint what we are feeling. It is much easier just to decide what we are doing. And when we know what someone is doing, we can make a much clearer decision about what the person actually is also feeling. So, the homosexual orientation is, of course, also related to one's own feelings and to one's own self-concept. Sexual behavior can take place, but it does not have to take place. While from a sexual health point of view, we are only interested in what actually takes place. Again, please keep in mind, we human beings are very much not easy to understand, because very often what we do is not connected with what we feel about. So please be always careful when you are dealing with patients who are approaching you, not to give them too quickly a label. Labels are useful for theoretical thinking, but when you deal with humans, it is better to let the people speak for themselves and then explore with the people how they can achieve something like an equilibrium, meaning that all the aspects of their sexuality, the corporal, the physical, as well as the emotional, and one might add also the soul aspect. Finally, we reach the third aspect of homosexuality, the so-called gay identity. I assume that many people who approach you as psychological counselors or therapists are approaching you because they need help to understand themselves better. That means who they really are. In a second step, we also need to understand what it means to have such an identity in a specific society. But nevertheless, we can't start with society, or we will never develop our own identity. So, what does it mean to have a homosexual identity? It means primarily that you are on one of 6 stages that make yourself feel that you are really an homosexual. Again, I repeat, although I use only the word homosexual and I often refer specifically to male homosexual, this is also true for all other forms of LGBTQ people. They all have the same outline of how they feel and how they reach awareness of their own sexuality. Although it is very simple to decide what someone is doing, it is very difficult to understand what is going on inside him. Actually, it is so difficult that most people don't even understand themselves. A classic case is when men who are defining themselves as heterosexuals actually have a lot of sex with other men because they see a lot of advantages in having sex with other men. One of the most important is that the other men know what you are needing to have a sexually pleasurable experience. Another one is that also homosexuals can be very interested in the physical outlines, as it is with heterosexuals. You all will have had clients who are happily married, who enjoy having sex with their female partners, but are still very much attracted to the penis. And maybe you also already have experienced that there are homosexuals who are really not into the other gender, but nevertheless would like to have available the other gender's genitalia. So a lesbian actually can really dislike men, but really can miss a penis. While I have to admit, it is very rare that homosexual men actually would like to have contact or even pictures of female genitalia, which is an interesting aspect we should talk some other time about more in detail. But let's talk about the identity. There are 6 stages, and these stages were already discovered 50 years ago. We have the first stage, which every homosexual person gets through. It is the identity confusion. First, they will wonder what they really are. Second, we have identity comparison. That means you try to figure out by looking at other people, who are they? identifying themselves. The third stage would be identity tolerance, meaning that you understand that every person has a different sexual identity. The fourth stage is that you can already accept your own identity. In the fifth stage, you have already developed an identity pride. And in the sixth stage, you have identity synthesis. Means you can live with the fact that you are an individual with an individual need for a specific sexuality. Of course, one of the main things which is always of interest to our patients, but also for us, we know very little actually about what makes orientation or identity. This has become even clearer in the last years, because all the surveys in the last years did show a rather steep decline in homosexual identity, while there was a rise in bisexual identity. So we as psychologists always have to ask ourselves, what does the client, the patient that is approaching us really needs, and what is the influence of society on these needs. Altogether, at least for the decades before the current decade, we have seen in all surveys that there is only a percentage of 1 to 3% of people who are more or less exclusively interested in men when they are men, or even lower in women when they are women. While we have now the phenomenon that up to 10, 15 and even 20% of the population claim that they are bisexual. So, what kind of explanatory models we have? This is not so important for our work as a psychologist, but it is also helpful to see what our patients might see when they say they are homosexual. Or again, this includes also transsexuality. This includes all other kinds of sexual identity, because the process how we develop our identity is always the same. As you all know, from a psychoanalytic point of view, there is the idea that homosexuality constitutes a standing still at a specific stage of psychosexual development. Well, it was an interesting theory, but so far it has not been proven very useful. Then we have the idea that it is genetic, which has the drawback that till now we haven't discovered a single gene that makes a person homosexual. In the sexological community, what we see mostly today is an interest in the endocrinological aspect of how homosexual behavior and, again, all other LGBTQ behaviors, because it has been very thoroughly proven that apparently during specific development stages in the womb, a fetus develops also what is called a more female or a more male brain, which means that homosexuality at its core is actually also on the physical level connected with how the body is wired. So actually, when we come to finally understand homosexuality, we can say that a homosexual sees, feels, experiences himself or herself much more than the heterosexual as being nearer already to the other gender, which explains why he or she is less attracted to the other gender, because he or she is already feeling very close to it. And let me conclude this. Sexuality in its basic understanding, even if it might be very superficial, is the wish to be connected with another person. And for this connection, we need both. We need to be near another person, and we need at the same time also the other person to be far from us. That means that what we all are attracted to other people sexually is we have to feel comfortable, so a certain way of similarity is given, but we also have to be attracted to how the other person is. In the time given, it was not possible to go very deep into the issue, but I hope I could give you some ideas of how interesting it is that there are so many different aspects of what constitutes homosexuality. It can constitute only a behavior, but it can also constitute an emotional attraction to the same gender, and it can constitute also a feeling of identity, who I am as a person. And I think that's the most important part of our work with homosexual clients. We have to find a way to understand who those people are, and we have to understand how we can help those people to feel comfortable with what they are and who they are, and maybe even who they want to become. Dear colleagues, thank you again very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. I wish you much success in your conference, and I really hope that I am able to attend your conferences soon in person again. Thank you very much and see you soon.